Hello, good evening. I'm Amara Nash, the Associate Director of Operations here at the CCA. Welcome to another wonderful program in our living room series and another Lost Classics Roundtable that we've all grown to love so much. Before I turn it over to our esteemed panelist, I just want to go through a couple of quick housekeeping things. One is we are going to change a little bit how we do the question and answer tonight. While you're still more than welcome to type your questions into the Q&A tool or the chat, we're also going to try a little bit of a live version. So if you raise your hand using the tool, the raise hand tool, because obviously we can't see you like you can see us, then we'll call on you and you can speak directly to the panelists. You should see a hand at the bottom of your screen that says raise hand. In some instances, I think it might be under something that says reactions, and then under that you can raise your hand. So let's see how that goes, a little more interactive ability. Also, we have adopted the Zoom closed captioning tool. So you should have the option to view captions as subtitles on the bottom of your screen, as a running chat in the chat box, or not at all, if that's your option. But hopefully this is another step towards making our programs just a little bit more accessible. If you have friends who might benefit from this tool, please let them know. And as always, if you'd like to see our upcoming Living Room Series programs or watch archived ones, you can do that on our website at ccasantafe.org. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the esteemed and always wonderful Paul Barnes, who is an editor, award-winning editor, educator, and overall wonderful human being we're so happy to have with us. And he will introduce you to the rest of our panelists tonight. Thanks, Paul.
All righty, thanks, Amara. Welcome everybody once again. It's great to be here with you. Tonight's film is Jacques Tati's remarkable Mon Oncle. And we're joined once again by Joan Tewksbury, who began her illustrious career as a dancer initially and then wound up into film production as a writer, director, producer. She wrote Robert Altman's Nashville and Thieves Like Us. Her feature film debut was a film that she wrote and directed called Old Boyfriends, and directed many more other movies, especially for television. And she's currently an advisor for the Sundance Institute, so she's a wonderful educator as well. And we're also joined once again by Mara Fortes. Mara lives in Mexico City. She's a film researcher and curator. She is currently working on a doctorate in film studies and media at the University of Chicago. And Mara has curated numerous film programs in Spain, Mexico, Colombia, and the UK, and also in the US at the Telluride Film Festival. So welcome everybody, and we can open up the program. I think, one reason why we chose Mon Oncle, we've given you kind of a heavy dose of heavy dramas lately. So we figured it might be time to lighten up the mood. Jacques Tati, for those of you who aren't that familiar with his work, is one of the great and most innovative and influential comic geniuses of film in the 20th century. His films are totally unique. Nobody makes films the way that Mr. Tati made. And so we thought it would be interesting, especially for you folks who may not be familiar with his work, to show you one of them. What's so interesting about Tati in terms of his comedy is it's so physical. He loved physical comedy. He loved creating specific movements for his characters to define who they were and how they functioned and moved in the world. He favored a wide shot so that you could actually see his figures from head to toe. and see every aspect of the movements. And he loved having group scenes in wide shots so that you could see all of the interactions, so that your eye could go around and discover, what this wonderful group of comic act performers that he chose were doing at the moment. And in many ways, what's interesting too is that he was somewhat more like a choreographer than a director in many ways, because he favored the wide shots and blocking his characters. And I think you probably noticed it as you watched the film, especially with the party scene in the patio, when they're moving from one part of the patio to the table in another part, and the kind of crazy dance-like movements as they use those blocks as stepping stones. It's such a Tati touch. And you may have noticed too that there's very little dialogue really. So that much of what comes across in the film is through movement and visuals. And Mara, maybe you want to comment on this. I mean, what struck you so much about the film was the sound effects, and how Tati made that a part of the fabric of the comedy of the film.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, I think it's interesting, as you say, like he uses these wide shots so that in a way makes the viewer much more active, because you're trying to decipher what's going on. But, instead of using like cutaways to focus on things that happen in that frame, he kind of manipulates your focus via sound. And there's actually a great quote from André Bazin, the French film critic. And, he talks about actually the human voices in Tati's films. And he says, it's not that they're not unintelligible, it's that they're insignificant. And that insignificance, it happens because there's such clarity in the soundtrack. And because you hear every other sound, like you hear the sounds of objects, and those tend to override the sounds of human voices. Yeah. And I was also thinking that I was talking to someone who's like, oh, so what's the film about? And it's actually because it's not a plot-driven film in the sort of conventional sense. All I found myself saying, yeah, so it's about this guy who goes visit his sister, and he has a special relationship with his nephew, and but it's sort of, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. So it's also I thought about it, and it's what's interesting is that the character really in these films is the space. It's not the people, and the people, the characters, because of the effect they have on that space. And I think the sound is kind of what he uses to create that tension between characters in that space and objects and people.
Yes, exactly.
It's also his use of sound to tell you what was going on architecturally at that particular time, with all the modern furniture and all of the new architecture going on. He doesn't talk about it, but you hear it. You hear there's nothing soft and cuddly in these rooms, and that people aren't communicating in a touching way at all. They can't, they'll fall down into the lawn. So he sets up this, and Paul, you had mentioned about his background, and I think it's really important to note what his father did, because it's not only the choreography, but it is the frame.
Right.
And so explain.
Yeah, Tati's background is really interesting. His father was somewhat like Mr. Arpel, the character in the film. He was a very upright, very proper, very prim man, always dressed as well as possible. He was renowned as a framer, and he had a quite renowned business framing paintings, and often actually framed paintings for Picasso and Dubuffet, amongst the many French artists who would come to him. And so that's how he kind of amassed his position as a solid middle-class citizen in French bourgeois society. And he really reveled in that. And everything had to be proper, everything had to be perfect, everything had to be a certain way. And Tati never fit into that at all. He was a shy, awkward child, always kind of oversized for his age. He wasn't good at school. He wasn't good at perfection until later. He could never pay strong attention to any kind of studies. He was really kind of a disappointment to his father in that regard. His father wanted him, to take over the family business and to, like him, become a solid member of this French middle class. And Tati just revolted constantly, to the point where the tension was so great that his father kicked him out, I think when he was about 16 or 17 years old. And so, from a relatively early age, Tati was on his own. But he was far more interested, as he once said, I disappointed my father by not becoming a framer because I actually, rather than frame something, I wanted to be at the center of the frame.
But he framed everything.
Right. And his career actually started off as a music hall performer. Actually, for a while, he was a semi-professional rugby player. Then he was attracted to the French music hall. And his most famous music hall act was actually creating a comic pantomime of how athletes moved in the field, how they cut the ball, how they threw the ball, how the ball passed them, I was watching a wonderful clip on the Dick Cavett show where Tati actually got up and did a section of this athletic pantomime that was just extraordinary. And you can see that what a genius he was at creating movements that were exaggerated and comic, but you knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't say a word, it was all mime, but you knew exactly where the ball was, where the ball was going, was he catching it, did he miss it, it was absolutely hilarious. And so that he became famous for doing that, and then actually was offered some minor supporting roles in films. And then when World War II broke out, he went into the war, into the army. The way he broke into film was he made a short film called The School for Postmen in 1947. And he enjoyed doing that so much, and it was well received as a short. He, a year later, was able to expand it into his first feature film, Jour des Fêtes, The Big Day, which was an expansion of this comic postman character that he created, which morphed into Mr. Hulot in the next few films. So that's kind of how he got, going in the field. But it's very interesting that, knowing his background with his father, you can see how, the elements of satire that he brings into the story of the Arpels, it's a reflection of his own childhood. Memories of all that was what he was bringing into the film in a certain way.
It's interesting too to think, I was reading that basically his filmography, which is 6 films over 30 years more or less, but it spans this period in France that was called the glorious 30 years. And it was the sort of post-war era of very rapid economic expansion and a lot of, migration from rural areas into the cities. And I found some pretty striking statistics from the 1950s. I think in the 1950s, about a third of the population in France still lived in villages. Most people still use animals for transportation and for work. And between 1954 and 1956, the spending in household appliances doubled across France, and it was mostly refrigerators and washing machines. But also, in the 50s, it was, having a car was still quite rare. I think, only about 25% of households had a car. And because of this influx of people into cities, they had to tear down a lot of the structures to build bigger buildings. And I think in the film, you kind of see that drama played out just in the transit between Monsieur Hulot going from this sort of village-like space into the big city, but it's also, the glorious 30 years were also the years of the Indochina War, the war in Algeria, the May 68. So there's this kind of dark undertow in the glorious 30 years. And, even though Tati's films are a comedy, it's not a comedy, you don't laugh so much at the comedian, you're laughing at the world. And I think part of that laughter is also that there's this, in a way, violence happening to that space, and to people having to conform to that space and adjust to that sort of complete transformation, from sort of urban, homogenized living.
And he seems to be a master at not talking about it. He shows it to you in the way that you are describing, so that you don't have to take up the real estate with dialogue. You simply can show it, and the audience can respond in that way. And it's what you said in the beginning, so that the space becomes the true character in the movie is what is holding it together in a way. So.
Right. And I don't know if you noticed it, but there is a contrast. Again, what Mara was describing about this kind of migration from rural France into urban France, that definitely was a part of what Tati was thinking about when he created the film. And if you think back on the film, there's a contrast between these wonderful village scenes where Tati or Mr. Hulot lives, and then he goes to the Arpels, and that's a representation of this kind of modern France that's being created, with this industrialization going on and the building of all of the housing projects around the old villages and around the old cities. And that was a definite contrast that Tati wanted to achieve in when he was thinking about the film and creating the film. There's a wonderful shot I love that's near the beginning of the film where Tati leaves his home and has to go over a broken wall. Right. And it's obviously an old broken village wall. And behind that is a whole row of those awful, housing projects. And he uses that image a couple of times in the film, going back and forth between the old and the new. And it's really very striking. And he doesn't do anything with dialogue in regards to that change. He just shows it. Yeah. And a part of what's interesting to me about the film is, his relationship with his nephew, is that whenever he takes charge of the nephew, he takes the nephew to the old village. Mm-hmm. And then the nephew gets to run around with the dogs, and he gets to run around with those kind of, oddball kids, kind of little rascal set of kids who are playing practical jokes on the villagers and eating giant crullers with jam and doing all these things that, his mother and father probably would not ever let him do. And so it's interesting that it's Hulot brings him into the old French world, which is more one of disarray and disorder in a way, and more open and free than the life that the nephew, is living with his mom and dad, which seems to be incredibly regimented.
It's also that, that wall that he goes through, there's a moment where he knocks a brick off of the already partially destroyed wall and he puts it back. And I find that so interesting because it's like there's this impulse to conserve the dilapidated structure because it's a symbol for, this space of relaxation and play. But yeah, I found that detail really striking. It's like, must put the brick back.
Seriously. I mean, he's so good at these little comic details that he finds, David Lynch, I was reading David Lynch is a huge fan of Tati's work. And what he says about Tati that was so striking to me is that he's one of the comic geniuses who was able to transform humor into poetry. Mm. And I think when you look closely at the films and you look at a detail like you're saying about replacing, he knocks the brick over, it's slightly comic, but then he puts it back. and even though it's a kind of, a part of Hulot's bumbling, awkward kind of character, it's also saying something else about wanting, to respect the old France and not to break it all down, to keep it in place. A tiny moment like that, but it really rings, and it resonates in that way, I think. And there's moments like that through the entire film that are quite striking, that makes him unique, I think, as a comic voice.
And it's also interesting to think of Chaplin and Buster Keaton as well, who used those kinds of oppositions and the humanness. I mean, just the sheer humanness is ridiculous and funny and lively, and the family keeps this kid so shut down so that there's no life. And the kid has great life when he is able to be on the bicycle with Tati and get dirty with the kids,
Yeah, well, exactly. Exactly.
Mara, you said something about watching the Truman Show.
Yes.
And
so I watched the Truman Show back to back with this film this week. And yeah, I mean, as you said, then it is the same film in a way. And when I was thinking of this violence, it's also the violence of feeling like you need to live as if you were an image, which I think resonates with what we experience nowadays too. With Facebook and everyone sort of documenting their life. It's like, we have to live as if we are, images in a catalog for products and for lifestyle and for.
Yep.
Are there any questions from the audience? Can we take any? Is anything coming in, Amara?
I hear.
Yes, there was artist. If you want to speak, I think I should have allowed you to talk.
Hi. I wondered, because you were talking about Tati and his commentary, implied commentary on the incredible reserve that the kid was subjected to. But at the end, almost the very, very end, before the dogs get out again, he takes his dad's hand. Yes. And the dad calls his name, and it's like, so what did you think of that? Do you think the kid's going to go straight, or the dad's going to loosen up?
Dad's going to loosen up a little. I think he's so surprised in the nicest way.
Yeah.
And it never would have happened if Tati hadn't been hanging around the house,
Right. Do you want to show that clip just to recall it? Should we take a look at that one, Joan?
Sure, it's absolutely. It's
clip number 4.
Maybe not.
No, there's a couple of questions too on the Q&A function.
Okay.
Oh wait, I think it's coming up.
Oh.
Amara, we can't see a clip. Is it playing?
It should be.
I'm not seeing anything. Are you guys seeing anything?
No.
Okay.
Oh. Well, we got a technical difficulty here. Should we take another question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's actually a couple of questions, and in a way it's good that we only heard the sounds of the clip, because then we can imagine the scene. But so Roberta Colton is asking if the house that the Arpels lived in based on a real home. It seems super ultra modern for its time.
It's actually not based on a real home, but it is based on a really well-known architectural style of the 50s. And Tati definitely wanted the home to reflect that architectural style. I'm drawing a blank on the architect's names now.
Le Corbusier, I think, that was the big sort of inspiration for.
Right, exactly. It was these very blocky, cement style buildings that were becoming quite popular in that era as the latest in terms of architectural innovation. And and for someone like Tati, I think it's funny. I think he was satirizing them, and as I said before, contrasting it with the old village architecture in France. But at the same time, there's a kind of, what's interesting about Tati to me is that the satire is never vicious. It's never really cruel. There's actually, because it's so exaggerated in a way, there's a little bit of an affection to it, that even though these things are a bit outlandish, like that the green couch with the bolster back and the bolster seat, and the other couch that Mr. Hulot actually turns over to make more comfortable so he can sleep on. He also has a kind of an affection and love for aspects of these modern innovations. He can't completely discount them and throw them out. It's also interesting to me that, like, in the architecture, or especially with the furniture or the clothes or the car, it's, there's so much color, and it's all this bright neon popping kind of color. And I think Tati himself once commented that he thought France was very gray. Everything was gray. The old buildings were gray. The sky was gray. And he felt like with a lot of this modern architecture and furniture and design, that an awful lot of wonderful color was coming in, and he appreciated that. So it is a kind of ambivalent attitude he had towards that, but it was definitely something that was ripe for satire, for sure. And he wound up basing that home on that Le Corbusier style, but it was completely designed for the film itself. And it was built, the entire thing was built and designed for the film production. They planned it all out. He planned it all out with his production designer.
And there's also an interesting comment from someone in the chat, Jackson Leibowitz. He says that he loved the staircase in Hulot's apartment. And I think that it's really interesting that that's kind of the foil to the modern house, because the modern house is, I think Le Corbusier used to say that home should be a machine for living. So everything should be super functional and uncluttered. And we never get to see inside Hulot's house. And it's so weird how the staircase, like, he has to make these really strange turns to get up there, that it's like you can imagine this labyrinthic, very Baroque interior that you never see. So it's kind of it's a lovely contrast, I think.
But it's also about life. And because on the staircase, you run into the lady next door, the bird that is owned by someone. So you are interfaced and interacting always with life the way you're not interacting with life, and I remember in the early 50s when modern furniture came to the United States, and it was about color and all those dopey shapes and zebra couches, and and it was just really huge contrast from the war, So, and women's fashion magazines that sort of dictated how your house was supposed to look.
Right. I mean, that scene when Hulot goes into his house is actually one of my favorites in the film. Yeah. And if you remember, it's only one shot. It's one wide shot that's actually held forever. But the way in which Tati choreographed it is, you see his legs on a window, then you see his torso going by another window, and then he goes and turns and you see his head coming up here, and then he disappears, and then he appears over here with just his part of his body. Right. I mean, Hulot becomes dissected by the windows as he goes from the bottom to the top. I mean, it's just hilarious to watch this.
It's also like a Leger painting.
Yes.
I mean, all of the art at that time being, and I keep thinking of Gerald Murphy, and later on you have Andy Warhol and Lichtenstein and all of these people who took ordinary things and made them they were objects of art, and which he did very early in this film in a way.
Yeah.
We go back to the art and the frame and his dad.
Yep. No, it's so true. But it's a wonderful, wonderful moment, very, very memorable, and it must have taken, again, in terms of, Tati's, he was very autocratic on the set, evidently. He hated taking breaks. He didn't want to take lunch breaks. He was so obsessed with his vision and perfection. I mean, here he is revolting against his father's demand for perfection. When he becomes a film director, he was the perfectionist extraordinaire. I mean, people talk about doing takes over and over and over and over again until they got the movements exactly right. But, to map out that traveling from the bottom floor of his house to the top in terms of the timing was really quite extraordinary. And to me, I mean, that home probably was a set that was built as well. So planning out the design of that, of where the windows would be, it took an awful lot of work, I think, to create that wonderful comic moment, but it's so brilliant.
And it's like Jerome Robbins and all of the comic stuff that Jerry did was always very mathematical in structure and depended on knowing exactly what was going to be in the frame.
I know. I mean, it's really incredible. It's like, the whole choreography with the stepping stones in the patio is unbelievable. It's like when Mr. Hulot first comes and he's following, I think, Mr. Arpel around, and the two men are turning left, and Hulot gets confused, he turns right. And then they go right, and then he turns left. And, they're stepping on all the stepping stones very precisely, and he's tentatively trying to find them. It's like the comedy of Hulot's awkwardness next to these two businessmen, who are maneuvering these stepping stones beautifully. It's just hilarious, and later on during the party, the same kind of thing when a group of people, don't want to step on the grass, and they're doing the same thing with the stepping stones, moving the table, moving the chairs. I mean, the choreography of that is just unbelievable.
Yes.
Tati probably drove those people nuts.
Crazy. Yeah. Yeah.
One actress who I saw in a clip who worked with him on Playtime said that it was one of her most memorable and favorite movies she ever worked in. She said, but it was also a horror show to work with Tati to make it.
Oh my God, yes.
It drove her absolutely crazy. Yeah.
So there's a question from Barbara Red. And I think I don't know if people who are posting questions on the Q&A, you can also talk live, because we also love to hear your voices. So Barbara is asking, what do you make of the characterization of the uncle as the quote unquote poor relation, stained raincoat, needs a job, note that they turn off the fountain when they see him at the gate? Actually, the fountain is really interesting because it's the kind of the prop that comments on class relations in the film, right? Because it's like whenever they hear the doorbell, they turn it on. But if they see that it's whatever, the guy delivering from the market, then he's not a worthy guest. So then they turn it off. And and the fountain kind of spits at them. It's like the object also is super classist.
Yes.
But then Hulot also knows that when the fountain is on, then there's probably annoying guests in the house. So there's actually one scene where he sees the fountain is on and he just doesn't go in because he doesn't want to interact with the potential guests of the Arpels.
Yes, exactly. But it's sort of, it's interesting you mentioned the poor relation, and it's true. It's when
Very much.
Tati was thinking about the character, he was thinking very much about the costume.
Yes.
And he planned to have Mr. Arpel in those suits, and Mrs. Arpel is always beautifully turned out with her very fashionable clothes, including her wonderful oversized, morning gown or dressing gown, which looks like it's 5 times too big for her. But for himself as Hulot, his pants are a little bit too short. He's got striped socks that don't quite match. That raincoat is awful. It's all rumpled and stained, and the hat, he actually spent a lot of time thinking about the hat and how to create the hat, because it's kind of, part of it is up and part of it is down. It's definitely all disheveled. And, and always with the pipe, the pipe had to be a part of it. And he wanted that to be a direct contrast to the Arpels and the fancy guests who were coming to the house, that he never quite could fit in. Always he was the outsider, the one who couldn't quite achieve any kind of real bourgeois respectability.
But he did make the ladies laugh.
Yeah.
Yes, a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's also this whole theme of pollution between spaces, right? Like the children, Hulot, and the dogs are the polluting forces that they never stop being themselves, no matter where they are. Like they don't conform to the space. And I think ultimately, although it's easy to read the film as this opposition between, nostalgia for the old France versus the new, it's not really about going back in the past, because I think back in the past then meant, going back to the Vichy,
Right.
Vichy regime, but it's more about resisting the kind of homogenization of the modern. And so, the awkwardness, the sort of being, not matching the furniture, because the Arpels, they I think their dress even matches, like it's color coded to the furniture. But that is also part of the theme, is like these polluting forces, and the cafe where people spill out into the street and they keep that energy of that festive energy in the street, as opposed to like the home that's completely hermetic and contained, and nothing can be out of place. And
I love them getting locked in the garage. I just
It is so wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And the dog has to open it.
oh,
yes. There's a comment too on the chat. Robert Gassaway says he loves the added layer of choreographing the dog. The dapper Dachshund in red flannel was more trained than the other neighborhood pack. He had to cross the frame in very intentional paths, just like the humans, following the manicured paths in the walled garden. But it's actually, I think, when he enters the house that he becomes really obedient, but outside he's kind of
he's a wreck
frolicking.
outside. Right.
I know. Well, just like the nephew, I think the dog in plaid enjoys going to the village to see his rough and ready friends.
Yeah. Yes. He gets to escape.
Right.
And then
And Tati,
sneak
I think
off.
once he said that he learned a lot from dogs. I think that's why dogs featured. And one of the things he said is that he loves that dogs don't engage in politics, that they pee wherever. It doesn't matter if it's like a new nice car structure or and they always pee the same way. Like they don't change their peeing style based on what the new engineers tell them.
Fabulous.
And that they always say hello to each other, so they're like very sociable, and they don't make, they're not prejudiced like humans are. So I thought that was a
That's
good
terrific.
anecdote to add.
That's fantastic. I know. Well, Tati himself was, it's interesting. The French screenwriter Jean-Claude Carrier was a very good friend of Tati's. And he said that Tati, when he was planning a film, he would spend hours and hours sitting in the cafes just watching people.
People, sure.
You know, he would spend all day long and he would see movements and interactions and facial expressions and dress styles, and he would be absorbing all of that as a part of the creativity for the characters he was about to create for the films. All of that came from observing real life on the French streets. So I mean, it's very interesting that was part of his process, to spend days doing that while he was planning a film, just people watching. And I think that extended to dog watching as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Was there
Actually, Amara, do you think we can play the clip number 4, that last clip? Is it possible, or is it just a breakdown?
We're going to try.
Okay. Oh man.
Very sweet.
You know what I love about that scene? Again, it recalls an earlier sequence when
Yes.
Hulot takes Gerard into the old village, and he's
Right.
hanging out with the boys. And
Yeah.
one thing they do after they get their crawlers is they go up on that hillside and they look at the people coming by near
Right.
the lamppost, and they whistle to distract them so that they bang into the
Right.
lamppost.
Yeah.
So at the end of the film, Tati has, Mr. Arpel whistle, and
Yeah.
that man runs into the lamppost. I mean, it's just what
It's beautiful rap without saying anything.
yeah, exactly. No,
Yeah.
it is. It's a wonderful, wonderful moment. It really is, and it was a great way to end the film.
Oh, and the dogs.
Exactly. Oh my word. Yeah, I love that scene on the hillside with the kids.
Yes. Yes.
Again, and it's all not really any dialogue at all. I mean, it's just, this is something the kids do constantly, it seems, is play this practical joke on the townspeople of seeing if they can get them to bang into the lamppost.
Right.
Yeah.
There was a question about plastic in who was that?
Oh yeah, it's a comment from Robert Gasaway. He says the plastic factory in this film is now where I imagine the man in The Graduate works when he's trying to persuade Dustin Hoffman to see his future career in plastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally, yes.
Could you show that clip?
Yeah, can we do clip number 2 at the factory?
M'en vais un moment, je t'envoie y aller à 5. D'accord.
Yes, Lucille Ball.
Oh
Yep.
my God, it is so hilarious. First of all, I just want to mention, the sound of high heels on
Oh,
concrete floors is one of the best sound effects in the whole film.
yes.
And especially with that secretary who goes from the
Yes.
pavement, and she has that very thin, tight skirt on. And so when she, hops across the pavement, and then she has to do this little bunny hop onto the sidewalk, and then she continues. I mean, again, in terms of choreography of movement, all the while she's clutching her papers,
Yes.
There's this, tall, slender figure who does this little hop. I mean, it was just wonderful. I mean,
Yep.
and then all the sound effects he creates for the tubing coming out, when it turns into balloons and then it turns into sausages.
Yeah, someone made the comment that it reminded them of you, Lucille Ball, and definitely it's like the chocolate papers in the chocolate.
I know. And again, there's a little subtle moment in there where, first these balloon shapes are coming out, right? And he's pressing buttons like a madman trying to get it. And then he thinks he fixes it because it's coming out of the head. And he's pointing, almost pointing to somebody off screen, like, I did it, it's okay. But then it suddenly, the sausage shapes come out.
Yes. Oh my.
Oh my word, And also the detail of, Hulot's, nobody really wanted to give Hulot the job. It's because
Right.
Mr. Arpel insisted. And where is his desk? In a hallway next to this steam vent, that may be spewing out chemicals that's putting him to sleep. I don't know. It's just,
Yeah.
the whole setup is just hilarious. Again, it's a class thing. It's almost like
Yes.
Hulot was even good enough to, get himself an office space.
Yes.
So I'm just keeping track of, so we have a few questions. I'm trying to find the best way to organize them. But Anne Gallagher asks, well, she says, what I think is wonderful is the way he sets up the joke. Can you discuss? And maybe, Anne, you can also talk, I would also turn it back to you and say, what do you laugh at when you watch the film? If you want to answer, you don't have to, but I always remember this thing. I think in improv comedy they say, the jokes aren't what gets the laughs, it's the specificity that gets people laughing. So I think specificity is Tati's forte.
Yes. And this is what was being discussed before about the absolute precision with the choreography of the human situation, and sitting in a coffee bar and watching how the human dilemma starts with a cup of coffee but can turn into 25 other things. And in a way, that's what you're saying about the specifics. That is the most important thing about setting up the joke.
Yeah, and I think that what I saw was that the camera pulls back, he sort of sets it up, and then finally you get the joke. And it just seems he goes through the whole film like that.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Yep, it's his dance with you.
Right, definitely.
I mean, it's like the little dog, that when they get stuck in the garage door, it's that the dog raised its tail, and activated the switch, but then he can't raise its tail back, and so can't activate the garage door. It's just those little moments that are genius.
But that whole sequence is very carefully choreographed, because from the moment that she pushes the button to give him the present, and that the garage door flies up and flies down, you say to yourself, this is going to be trouble.
Yes.
I think this is Robert. I think the sequence I laughed at most was the owner of the factory. When he comes to the factory, you see that it's totally dysfunctional. They only know he's on the premises because the dog trots by them first, and they start being busybodies. And then he comes upon his brother-in-law splayed out on the floor, looking like he's loafing around. But they don't, that's the joke. They don't pay it off. Like if this is an American film, they would have a big blow up about it. He would confront him about it, and it'd be more jokes after that. But he just lets it go. He never confronts him about it, and he just goes on his way. And he knows that's just how Hugh Lowe is. But for as rich and put together as this guy is, that seems to be living in the future, his business is totally running on fumes, apparently.
But the other thing that he does too is he often doesn't land anything. He will let it drift off as you are describing, because it keeps you engaged in following what is going to happen next, rather than having a series of finishes or landings throughout the story. So it's like he throws the fish hook in you, and you just keep getting reeled in a way, which I appreciate.
Oh yes. No, Tati likes a slow build up. He sets it up and then he slowly lets it unfold.
Yeah.
So there's also a question about the neighbor lady from Maria Cristina Di Stefano. What do we make of the character of the neighbor lady?
Oh, heaven.
Right.
I've never on her bicycle, on her exercycle, going around the lawn that's about as big as a postage stamp.
Right.
She too is a terrific comment on class and striving for the bourgeois. Yeah.
And I also thought, this is maybe I'm projecting too much, but also like imperialism, because she wears these kind of ethnic chic, clothes. So I thought it was some weird comment also on the decadence of the French Empire.
But also that you have to be au courant. I mean, the style is not just being current, but you have to crank it up another notch with your hat, or, and the boyfriend coming, oh gosh.
Yes, the horseman. I know. I thought the same thing, Mara, when the neighbor first came to visit. She's wearing that, handmade hat and a matching purse. And I kept thinking it must have been some kind of trinket, from Vietnam or something. Had that Asian kind of look, and France at the time was still in control of Vietnam. So it was this funny little comment in a way, very subtle, but definitely, But it also, in terms of her character, Joan, it's what you said. It's like she had to be au courant and a little bit more chic than Mrs. Arpel.
Oh, yeah.
So she's bringing this unusual fashion statement, of the peasant wear, with her,
Oh, God. Oh,
and you can see how Mrs. Arpel is so set on impressing this woman.
oh,
She
God.
really was.
Yes.
That was very clear in the way in which we were interacting.
There's two questions that are sort of more about Tati, and one is from Shauna Daly. She wants to know how the film was reviewed when it was first released versus more recent reviews. And then there's another question about Tati's background in French music hall, and if Tati was influenced by great silent film comedians like Chaplin and Keaton.
Yeah. Could I respond to the first question was, I'm sorry, I'm just.
Oh, the first question, sorry, it was about how the film was reviewed when it was first released versus more recent appreciations of the film.
Right. It was funny because in France, I mean, it was somewhat like Umberto D, where, the French themselves were a little bit upset at being so heavily satirized. It's like they couldn't quite take it. And so some of the response in France was quite negative. But, the film was overall very well received. It was a hit in theaters. It made a great deal of money. It won the jury prize at Cannes that year when it was shown at Cannes. And then it was a huge international hit all around the world. The film wound up going on to win the Oscar for Best Foreign Film when it was released in the States. It was probably Tati's biggest hit, actually.
Yeah.
And I think that critics noticed all of the comic innovation that was contained in Mon Oncle. He had done Jour de Fête, he had done Mr. Hulot's Holiday, but Mon Oncle kind of took his genius a step further, I think, and was more innovative, even in terms of the themes that he was dealing with. And a lot of critics really recognized that and respected that. So it was quite a big success for him. In terms of the influences, Tati loved mimes. And so, when he was thinking about becoming a performer, he studied, France was really well known for their mimes. Marcel Marceau and a whole host of it. It was a regular feature of the French music hall at the time, were these famous mimes that were there. And I think Tati really admired that. But he definitely also studied the silent comedians. He eventually became friends with Harold Lloyd and Buster Keaton and Chaplin. He knew their work very, very well. I think he deeply admired Keaton, especially because for Hulot, he gave Hulot that same kind of deadpan facial demeanor that Keaton was so famous for. Hulot never breaks up into a smile at all. And his reaction is always totally deadpan, no matter what's going on. And so I think he stole that from Keaton for sure. So
I also read, I think it was maybe one of the Criterion essays, that he talks about that his inspiration for the Hulot character was this film made by Alice Guy Blaché in 1900,
really,
called Little Tick, and it's this sort of performer. It's a little 1-minute film about this performer wearing these giant boots. So I think it's on YouTube and you can watch it. And I mention it because it's also important to mention Alice Guy, since not very many people know, and she was a very prolific silent film director and a woman. So just inserting that.
Oh, it's nice to hear that Alice Guy was an influence on Mr. Tati.
I know, yeah. So Tony Malmed, and Tony, you can also open your mic if you want to, but he says, I saw this film when I was 7 years old, and then not again since last night. I just remembered that it changed my life. Now I might say how it showed a fluidity of life I hadn't seen at that point. In the context of the development of film and art in film, how and in what way did this break ground?
Mhm. Well, I think, Tony, it's Tati was bringing a kind of silent film comedy back that hadn't been seen for a long time. Because of sound, comedy really developed into more of a verbal, dialogue-driven, for the most part. I mean, not entirely, but or was a wonderful mixture of both, with dialogue and slapstick. But what Tati did was kind of, strip away all the dialogue again and go back to the essentials of visuals, and feeling like, he could tell his story visually as much as possible. He could create all of the comedy visually, without any dialogue really. For him, the sound was the comic sound effects. And nobody had really done that with sound the way that Tati did. The crazy sound of the high heels, just that alone, it's so hilarious. But again, with the silent comedians had no sound to play with in that regard. And Tati saw that as a real element, a real tool that he could use to really create his comedy and do something that was quite different. And that the use of sound in Tati's film was definitely very influential on later film comedies that came along. The Monty Python folks, especially. Terry Jones is again a huge Tati fan. He loved Tati's films. Yeah.
And I think it was Marguerite Duras, but she said that the twin giants of modern French cinema were Bresson and Tati, and that they actually had a lot in common. And it's interesting to think, obviously one is way more sober and the other is coming, but I think the idea of how to use sound, the fact that they didn't really belong to a movement. They were post-war, but they weren't part of the Nouvelle Vague, but they influenced the Nouvelle Vague. But I was also thinking, since we showed the Bresson film, The Man Escaped, and one of the Bresson quotes there was, when you're in prison, nothing is more important than the door. And I thought about that quote in this film because, they are in the prison of this modern home, and nothing is more important than that door. It was like this really weird echo between the films that we show.
Oh, that's very true. That is true. Yeah. Yeah, there's a kind of interesting, you might describe it as a kind of stripped down minimalism that Tati is working with in a comic way that almost is a reflection of the stripped down minimalism in terms of drama that Bresson uses. It's just one is comedy and one is drama. That's an interesting correlation. I hadn't really thought of that before.
But also in terms of the art world, that things were being totally stripped down into cubism and surrealism and all of those things, taking the real and heightening it to a degree, and not having a lot of clutter. So, he took that to heart, and
No, it's definitely true, I think. And I think that's what makes him unique as a visionary.
Very much, yes.
His films are as distinct as Bresson's.
Yeah.
And Marcia Swiss wants to know if we can comment on the use of flamboyant American cars.
I love that car. I want that car.
You may not have it. No.
Well, again, it was part of that, French fascination during that period with anything new and modern, anything that was American. We loved American cars for sure. Remember too that this was the period, with Elvis Presley and those kinds of innovations in music. The same year that Tati's Mon Uncle was released, Brigitte Bardot's And God Created Woman was released. So this fascination with kind of pop culture and American commercialism, American commodities, I think was a part of what he was seeing and incorporating into the film in a way. Thinking about the cars, there's a little bit of dialogue that he's getting a new car, and so it's going to happen, but you don't see it. And when I finally saw it, I was so surprised at how colorful it was. I mean, I love the paint job on that car, and again, it was a reflection of the furniture in the house and those bright colors that he was trying to use to contrast with the concrete. It was really interesting to me, because I would have expected Mr. Appel to buy a black car or a gray car. So there is a little bohemian streak in Mr. Appel.
He was trying to please his wife, It went with her dress. Yes. Oh.
In a weird way, I don't know if you've seen the film Safe, the Todd Haynes film with Julianne Moore. Somehow the car reminded me of the couch, like when they bring the couch and it's the wrong color. It's like that same horror of the car entering the house.
Oh, man. Do you have any more questions?
Let's see if we missed something. Any more questions or comments? How are we doing for time?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a clock nearby. Do you guys know what time it is? Oh, Amara says.
Okay. So Amara says we should be wrapping up. So if anyone has questions or comments, and now that we have the option of speaking live, please do so now, or forever hold, or until the next time, hold your thoughts.
Nobody else?
Nobody else, it looks like.
Okay, good. Can I make just let people know what happened to Tati? It's kind of an interesting, unfortunately sad story about what happened. Mon Uncle was such a huge success and such a huge hit that his ambition skyrocketed. And so his next film, Playtime, which really is an extraordinary masterpiece. I mean, it's an unbelievable film. And if you enjoyed Mon Uncle, you should really take a look at Playtime. But he started that film in 1961 and filmed it for 6 years. And it was so elaborate with the sets that they kept spending money and spending money and spending money. And Tati's producers couldn't keep him under control. The distributor couldn't keep him under control. He kept insisting on adding and changing and redoing and building more. And the production company went bankrupt. Tati himself went bankrupt because he put all of his own money into Playtime. And then when it was released in '67, it was almost 10 years since Mon Uncle. And it didn't get the attention. It didn't receive, people kind of, his time had sort of passed by '67 in a certain way. And so it financially was not successful. And even at the time, it didn't get the critical attention that the previous films had. And so Tati was forced to sell the rights to all his old films, sell the rights to the negatives. He was basically penniless. And the last two films he made, Traffic and Parade, basically they're commercial projects that didn't really have his stamp on them. He didn't really enjoy making them because he didn't have total control. And so the end of his life, his joie de vivre, which he had always had his entire life, kind of disappeared. Friends said that, the financial disasters that resulted from Playtime took a real toll on him. And he was getting older, illnesses set in. So the end of his life was really very sad because he never had a chance to make another film the way he really desired to make it. and was very disappointed by the reception of Playtime. And so he unfortunately, died in that kind of a state. There's one wonderful anecdote I'd like to just end with, which is about when he did die. He was very, very close with his wife Marceline and his daughter Sophie, and they were both with him when he was in the hospital. And a theater director friend of his, Jerome Deschamps, told this anecdote in an interview I saw. And he said when Tati died, he called his wife and Sophie close for a farewell. And he said, he drew them close and said, come here, I want to, and so they came very close because he wasn't speaking very loudly. He said, Tati's last words were, I think there's a love affair going on between the serving girl and the big black cleaning guy. And then he died. So he went on working right till the end.
Heaven.
Some kind of comic scenario between this serving girl and the big black cleaning guy. I mean, that's Tati.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I think we could end with that. What do you think?
Yes, lovely.
Perfect.
Good night, guys.
Good night.